everyone. Just make sure I am live. Lighting our lovely candle. Don't play with these are very dangerous. Can we all see me okay? Thank you. The next setup. So, yeah. Today we are going to be doing another read of Harry Potter. And we're going through chapter 2 until however long we can get to. Can everyone hear the music alright? And can you hear me okay? Or do I need to speak a little louder? Yep, are we all okay? I know you're okay. I was wondering if you can hear me okay. Is everything alright? We are going to change the colours to a lovely teal blue. Or shall we stick it at pink? What shall we do? And hello for 2 viewers that I have. I think we'll stick with the pink. We'll stick with pink. We're sticking with pink, we're not going with blue. We'll go with blue next time. I think pink fits the vibe a little bit more. Right. It's time to get reading. So, today we are reading chapter 2, The Vanishing Glass. And if you would like to see the first chapter of me reading chapter 1, which is The Boy Who Lived, that will be on my YouTube channel. It's the same as this, it's Let's Read Stories. So yes. Right. Chapter 2. Nearly 10 years had passed since the Dursleys had woken up to find their nephew on the front door step. But Privet Drive had hardly changed at all. The sun rose and the same tidy front gardens and lit up the brass number 4 on the Dursleys' front door. It crept into the living room, which was almost exactly the same as it had been on the night when Mr. Dursley had seen that fateful news report about the owls. Only the photographs on the mantelpiece really showed how much time had passed. 10 years ago there had been lots of pictures of what looked like a large pink beach ball wearing different coloured bobble hats. But Dudley Dursley was no longer a baby, and now the photographs showed a large blonde boy riding his first bicycle on a roundabout at the fair, playing a computer game with his father. being hugged and kissed by his mother. Come to think of it, we're going to use our trusty wand to help me read. This is the Architect wand that I got from the Harry Potter Studios in London. Go check it out. We shall carry on reading. The room held no sign at all of the other boy who lived in the house too. Yet Harry Potter was still there, asleep at the moment, but not for long. His Aunt Petunia was awake, and it was her shrill voice which made the first noise of the day. Up! Get up! Now! Harry woke with a start. His aunt rapped on the door again. Up! She screeched. Harry heard her walking towards the kitchen, and then the sound of frying pan being put on the cooker. He rolled onto his back and tried to remember the dream he had been having. It had been a good one. There had been flying motorbikes in it. He had a funny feeling he had the same dream before. His aunt was back outside the door. Are you up yet? She demanded. Nearly, said Harry. Well, get a move on. I want you to look after the bacon, and don't you dare let it burn. I want everything perfect on my Dudley's birthday. Harry groaned. What did you say? His aunt snapped through the door. This is a page that we just read, and the nice little illustration there. On to the next page. Nothing. Dudley's birthday. How could he have forgotten? Harry got slowly out of bed and started looking for socks. He found a pair under his bed and after putting a spider off one of them, put them on. Ooh. Harry was used to spiders because the cupboard under the stairs was full of them, and that was where he slept. When he was dressed, he went down the hall into the kitchen. The table was almost hidden beneath all Dudley's birthday presents. It looked as though Dudley had got a new computer he wanted, not to mention the second television and the racing bike. Exactly why Dudley wanted a racing bike was a mystery to Harry, as Dudley was very fat and hated exercise. Unless, of course, it involved punching somebody. Dudley's favourite punching bag was Harry, but he couldn't often catch him. Harry didn't look it, but he was very fast. Perhaps it had something to do with living in a dark cupboard, but Harry had always been a small and skinny for his age. He looked even smaller and skinnier than he really was, because all he had to wear was an old clothes of Dudley's, and Dudley was about 4 times bigger than he was. Harry had a thin face, knobbly knees, black hair and bright green eyes. He wore round glasses held together with a lot of sellotape, because of all the times Dudley has punched him on the nose. The only thing Harry liked about his own appearance was the very thin scar on his forehead, which was shaped like a bolt of lightning. He had had it so long, as long as he can remember. At the first question he could ever remember asking his Aunt Petunia was how he had got it. In a car crash when your parents died, she said, and don't ask questions. Don't ask questions. That was the first rule of a quiet life with the Dursleys. Uncle Vernon entered the kitchen as Harry was turning over the bacon. Comb your hair, he barked, but way as a morning greeting. About once a week, Uncle Vernon looked over the top of his newspaper and shouted at Harry that he needed a haircut. Harry must have had more haircuts than the rest of the boys in his class put together, but it made no difference. His hair simply grew that way, all over the place. Harry was frying eggs by the time Dudley arrived in the kitchen with his mother. Dudley looked a lot like Vernon. He had a large pink face, not much neck, small, watery blue eyes, thick blonde hair that lay smoothly on his thick, fat head. Aunt Petunia often said that Dudley looked like a baby angel. Harry often said that Dudley looked like a pig in a wig. Harry put the plate of egg and bacon on the table, which was difficult as there wasn't much room. Dudley, meanwhile, was counting the presents. His face fell. 36, he said, looking up at his mother and father. That's 2 less than last year. Darling, you haven't counted Auntie Marge's present. See, it's there under the big one from Mummy and Daddy. All right, 37 then, said Dudley, going red in the face. Harry, who could have see a huge Dudley tantrum coming on, being wolfing down his bacon as fast as possible in case Dudley turned the table over. By the way, this was the page for that a lot of reading. It sort of carried on, so I wasn't able to stop and show you before I turned the page. Let's continue. Aunt Petunia obviously sensed danger too, because she said quickly, "And we'll buy you another 2 presents while we're out today. How about that, Popkin? 2 more presents. Is that all right?" Dudley thought for a moment. It looked like hard work. Finally, he said slowly, "So I'll have 30. 39, sweet tums," said Aunt Petunia. "Oh," Dudley said as Dudley sat down heavily and grabbed the nearest parcel. "All right then." Uncle Vernon chuckled. "Little Tyke wants his money's worth, just like his father. Attaboy, Dudley." He ruffled Dudley's hair. At the moment the telephone rang and Aunt Petunia went to answer it while Harry and Uncle Vernon watched Dudley unwrap the new racing bike, a cine camera, a remote control aeroplane, 16 new computer games, and a video recorder. He was ripping the paper off a gold wristwatch when Aunt Petunia came back from the telephone, looking both angry and worried. "Bad news, Vernon," she said. "Mrs. Fig's broken her leg. She can't take him." She jerked her head in Harry's direction. Dudley's mouth fell open in horror, but Harry's heart gave a leap. Every year on Dudley's birthday, his parents took him and his friend out for the day, the adventure park, hamburger bars, or the cinema. Every year, Harry was left behind with Mrs. Fig, a mad old lady who lives 2 streets away. Harry hated it there. The whole house smelled of cabbage, and Mrs. Fig made him look at photographs of all the cats she had ever owned. "Now what?" said Aunt Petunia, looking furiously at Harry, as though he planned this. Harry knew he ought to feel sorry that Mrs. Fig had broken her leg, but it wasn't easy when he reminded himself it would be a whole year before he had to look at Tibbles, Snowy, Mr. Paws and Tuffy again. "We could phone Marge," Uncle Vernon suggested. "Don't be silly, Vernon. She hates the boy." The Dursleys often spoke of Harry like this, as though he wasn't there, or rather as though he was something very nasty that couldn't understand them, like a slug. "What about, what's her name, your friend, Yvonne, on holiday in Morocco?" snapped Aunt Petunia. "You could just leave me here," Harry put in hopefully. He'd be able to watch what he wanted on television for a change, and maybe even have a go on Dudley's computer. Aunt Petunia looked as though she had just swallowed a lemon. "And come back to find the house in ruins?" she snarled. "I won't blow up the house," said Harry, but they weren't listening. "I suppose we could take him to the zoo," said Aunt Petunia slowly, "and leave him in the car." "That car's new. He's not sitting in it alone." Dudley began to cry loudly. In fact, he wasn't really crying. It had been years since he'd really cried, but he knew that if he'd screwed up his face and wailed, his mother would give him anything he wanted. "Dinky Daddyums, don't cry. Mummy won't let him spoil your special day," she cried, flinging her arms around him. That's this page that we just read. "I don't want him to come," Dudley yelled between huge pretended sobs. "He always spoils everything," he shouted at Harry, nasty grin through the gap of his mother's arms. Just then the doorbell rang. "Oh, good Lord, they're here," said Aunt Petunia frantically. And a moment later, Dudley's best friend, Piers Polkiss, walked in with his mother. Piers was a scrawny boy with a face like a rat. He was usually the one who held people's arms behind their back while Dudley hit them. Dudley stopped pretending to cry at once. Half an hour later, Harry, who couldn't believe his luck, was sitting in the back of Dursley's car with Piers and Dudley on the way to the zoo for the first time in his life. His aunt and uncle hadn't been able to think of anything else to do with him, but before they'd left, Uncle Vernon had taken Harry aside. "I'm warning you," he said, putting his large purple face right up close to Harry's. "I'm warning you now, boy. Any funny business, anything at all, and you'll be in that cupboard from now until Christmas." "I'm not going to do anything," said Harry, honestly. But Uncle Vernon didn't believe him. No one ever did. The problem was, strange things often happened around Harry, and it was just no good telling the Dursleys he didn't make them happen. Once Aunt Petunia, tired of Harry coming back from the barber's looking as though he hadn't been at all, had taken a pair of kitchen scissors and cut his hair so short it was almost bald except for a fringe, which she'd left to hide that horrible scar. Dudley had laughed himself silly at Harry, who had spent sleepless nights imagining school the next day, where he would already laugh at his baggy clothes and sellotaped glasses. Next morning, however, he had gone up to find his hair exactly as it had been before Aunt Petunia had sheared it off. He had been given a week in a cupboard for this, even though he had tried to explain that he couldn't explain how it had grown back so quickly. Another time, Aunt Petunia had been trying to force him into a revolting old jumper of Dudley's, brown with orange bubbles. The harder she tried to pull it over his head, the smaller it seemed to become, until finally it might have fitted a glove for a puppet, but certainly wouldn't fit Harry. Aunt Petunia had decided that it must have shrunk in the wash, and to his great relief, Harry was unpunished. On the other hand, Harry had gotten into terrible trouble for being found on the roof of the school kitchens. Dudley's gang had been chasing him as usual, when, as much to Harry's surprise as anyone else, there he was sitting on the chimney. The Dursleys had received a very angry letter from Harry's headmistress, telling them Harry had been climbing school buildings, but all he had to do as he shouted at Uncle Vernon through the locked doors of his cupboard, was jumped behind the big bins outside the kitchen doors. Harry supposed that wind must have caught him in mid-jump. But today nothing was going to go wrong. It was even worth being with Dudley and Pierce to be spending the day somewhere that wasn't school. His cupboard or Mrs. Vig's cabbage-smelling living room. While he drove, Uncle Vernon complained to Aunt Petunia. He liked to complain about things. People at work, Harry, the council, Harry, the bank that Harry were just a few of his favourite subjects. This morning it was motorbikes, roaring along like maniacs, the young hoodlums. I was about to read hooligans. He said as a motorbike overtook them. I had a dream about motorbikes, said Harry, remembering suddenly. It was flying. And this is the page. And on the page it has the little sweatshirt that Aunt Petunia was trying to force onto Harry. Oh. Don't want that slipping out. Next page we go. Uncle Vernon nearly crashed into the car in front. He turned right around in his seat and yelled at Harry, his face like gigantic beetroots with a moustache. Motorbikes don't fly. Dudley and Pierce snickered. I know they don't, said Harry. It was only a dream. But he wished he hadn't said anything. There was one thing that Dursleys hated even more than his asking questions, is his talking about anything, acting in a way he shouldn't. No matter if it was a dream or even a cartoon. They seemed to think he might get dangerous ideas. It was a very sunny Sunday, and the zoo was crowded with families. The Dursleys brought Dudley and Pierce large chocolate ice creams at the entrance, and then, because the smiling lady in a van asked Harry what he wanted before they could hurry him away, they brought him a cheap lemon ice lolly. It wasn't bad either, Harry thought, licking it as they watched a gorilla scratching its head and looking remarkably like Dudley, except that it wasn't blonde. Harry had the best morning he had in a long time. He was careful to walk a little way apart from the Dursleys so that Dudley and Pierce, who were starting to get bored with the animals by lunchtime, wasn't fall back on their favourite hobby of hitting him. They ate in the zoo restaurant, and when Dudley had a tantrum because his knickerbocker glory wasn't big enough, Uncle Vernon brought him another one, and Harry was allowed to finish the first. Harry felt afterwards that he should have known it was all too good to last. After lunch they went to the reptile house. It was cool and dark in here, with lit windows all along the walls. Behind the glass, all sorts of lizards and snakes were crawling and slithering over bits of wood and stone. Dudley and Pierce wanted to see huge, poisonous cobras and thick, man-crushing pythons. Dudley quickly found a large snake in place. It could have wrapped its body twice around Uncle Vernon's car and crushed it into a dustbin. But at the moment it didn't look in the mood. In fact, it was fast asleep. Dudley stood with his nose pressed against the glass, staring at the glistening brown coil. Make it move, he whined at his father. Uncle Vernon tapped on the glass, but the snake didn't budge. Do it again, Dudley ordered. Uncle Vernon rapped the glass smartly with his knuckles, but the snake just snoozed on. "This is boring," Dudley moaned. He shuffled away. Harry moved in front of the tank and looked intently at the snake. He wouldn't have been surprised if it had died of boredom itself. No company except stupid people drumming their fingers on the glass, trying to disturb it all day long. It was worse than having a cupboard as a bedroom, where the only visitor was Aunt Petunia's hammering on the door to wake you up. At least he got to visit the rest of the house. This is the thingy. Yeah, the page of the reptile house. Next page we shall go. The snake suddenly opened its beady eyes. Slowly, very slowly, it raised its head until its eyes were on level with Harry's. It winked. Harry stared. Then he looked quickly around to see if anyone was watching. They weren't. He looked back at the snake and winked too. The snake jerked its head towards Uncle Vernon and Dudley, then raised its eyes to the ceiling. It gave Harry a look that was quite plainly, "I get that all the time." "I know," Harry murmured through the glass, though he wasn't sure the snake could hear him. "It must be really annoying." The snake nodded vigorously. "Where did you come from anyway?" Harry asked. The snake jabbed its tail at the little sign next to the glass. Harry peered at it. "Boa Constrictor, Brazil." Was it nice there? The boa constrictor jabbed its tail in the sign again, and Harry read on. "This specimen was bred in the zoo." "Oh, I see. So you've never been to Brazil?" As the snake shook his head, a deafening shout behind Harry made both of them jump. "Dudley! Mrs. Dursley! Come and look at the snake! You won't believe what he's doing!" Dudley came waddling towards them as fast as he could. "Out of the way, you!" he said, punching Harry in the ribs. Caught by surprise, Harry fell on the concrete floor. What came next happened so fast, no one saw how it happened. 1 second, Pierce and Dudley were leaning right up close to the glass. The next, they had kept back with a howl of horror. They had leapt back with a howl of horror. Harry sat up and gasped. The glass front of the boa constrictor's tank had vanished. The great snake was uncoiling itself rapidly, slithering out to the floor. People throughout the reptile house screamed and started running for the exit. As the snake slid swiftly past him, Harry could have sworn a low hissing voice said, "Brazil, here I come. Thanks, amigo." The keeper of the reptile house was in shock. "But the glass," he kept saying. "Where did the glass go?" The zoo director himself made Aunt Petunia a cup of strong sweet tea, while he apologised over and over again. Pierce and Dudley could only gibber. As far as Harry had seen, the snake hadn't done anything except snap playfully at their heels as it passed. But by the time they were all back at Uncle Vernon's car, Dudley was telling them how it had nearly bitten off its leg, whilst Pierce was swearing it had tried to squeeze him to death. But worst of all, for Harry at least, Pierce was claiming down enough to say, "Harry was talking to it, weren't you, Harry?" Uncle Vernon waited until Pierce was safe out of the house before starting on Harry. He was so angry he could hardly speak. He managed to say, "Go. Cupboard. Stay. No meals." Before he collapsed into his chair, and Aunt Petunia had to run and get him a large brandy. Harry lay in his dark cupboard much later, wishing he had a watch. He didn't know what time it was, and he couldn't be sure that the Dursleys were asleep yet. Until they were, he couldn't risk sneaking to the kitchen for some food. Oh, I haven't shown you the page yet. And this is the page with the snake talking to Harry. On to the next page. He had lived with the Dursleys for almost 10 years. 10 miserable years. As long as he could remember. Ever since he had been a baby and his parents had died in that car crash. He couldn't remember being in the car with his parents when his parents had died. Sometimes he strained his memory during long hours in the cupboard. He came up with a strange vision, a blinding flash of green light and a burning pain on his forehead. This, he supposed, was the crash, though he couldn't imagine where the green light came from. He couldn't remember his parents at all. His aunt and uncle never spoke of them, and of course he was forbidden to ask questions. There were no photographs of them in the house. When he had been younger, Harry had dreamed a dream of some unknowing relation coming to take him away, but it had never happened. The Dursleys were his only family, yet sometimes he thought, or maybe hoped, that the strangers in the street seemed to know him. Very strange strangers they were too. A tiny man in a violet top hat had bowed to him once while out shopping with Aunt Petunia and Dudley. After asking Harry furiously if he knew the man, Aunt Petunia had rushed them out of the shop without buying anything. A wild-looking old woman dressed in all green had waved merely at him once at bus stop. A bald man in a very long purple coat had actually shaken his hand in the street the other day and then walked away without a word. The weirdest thing about all of these people was the way they seemed to vanish a second Harry tried to get a closer look. At school, Harry had no one. Everybody knew that Dursley's gang hated the old Harry Potter in his baggy old clothes and broken glasses, and nobody liked to disagree with Dudley's gang. We shall, in this page, Chapter 3. The letters from no one. By the way, I forgot to show you the thing of the chapter. This is what this chapter looks like. The nice little illustration there. Chapter 3. The escape of the Brazilian boa constrictor earned Harry his longest ever punishment. By the time he was allowed out of his cupboard again, the summer holidays had started and Dudley had already broken his new cine camera, crashed his remote control aeroplane, and first time on his racing bike, knocked down old Mrs. Fig as she crossed Privet Drive on her crutches. Harry was glad school was over, but there was no escaping Dudley's gang, who visited the house every single day. Pierce, Dennis, Malcolm, and Gordon were all big and stupid. But as Dudley was the biggest and stupidest of the lot, he was the leader. The rest of them were all quite happy to join in Dudley's favourite sport, Harry hunting. This was why Harry spent as much time as possible out of the house, wondering about thinking about. There we are. and thinking about the end of the holidays, where he could see a tiny ray of hope. When September came, he would be going off to secondary school, and for the first time in his life, he wouldn't be with Dudley. Dudley had a place at Uncle Vernon's old school, Smeltings. Pierce Polkins was going there too. Harry, on the other hand, was going to Stonewall High, the local comprehensive. Dudley thought this was very funny. The stuffed people's heads down the toilet first day of Stonewall, he told Harry. Want to come upstairs and practice? No thanks, said Harry. The poor toilets never had anything as horrible as your head down it. It might be sick. Then he ran, before Dudley could work out what he said. One day in July, Aunt Petunia took Dudley to London to buy his Smeltings uniform, leaving Harry at Mrs. Figg's. Mrs. Figg wasn't as bad as usual. It turned out she had broken her leg tripping over one of her cats, and she didn't seem quite as fond of them as before. She let Harry watch television and gave him a bit of chocolate cake that tasted as though she had it for several years. That evening, Dudley paraded around the living room for the family in his brand new uniform. Smelting boys wore maroon tailcoats, orange knickerbockers, and flat straw hats called boaters. They only carried knobby sticks. They also carried knobby sticks as used for hitting each other while the teachers weren't looking. They were supposed to be good training for later life. As he looked at Dudley in his new knickerbockers, Uncle Vernon said gruffly that it was the proudest moment of his life. Aunt Petunia burst into tears and said that she couldn't believe it was her ickle Dudley Kings. He looked so handsome and grown up. Harry didn't trust himself to speak. He thought two of his ribs might already have cracked from not trying to laugh. There was a horrible smell in the kitchen the next morning when Harry went in for breakfast. It seemed to be coming from the large metal tub in the sink. He went to have a look. The tub was full of what looked like dirty rags swimming in grey water. "What's this?" he asked Aunt Petunia. Her lips tightened, as they always did if he dared to ask a question. "Your new school uniform," she said. Harry looked in the bowl again. "Oh," he said. "I didn't realise it had to be so wet." "Don't be stupid," snapped Aunt Petunia. "I'm dyeing some of Dudley's old things grey for you. It'll look just like everyone else's when I've finished." Harry seriously doubted this, but thought it best not to argue. He sat down at the table and tried not to think about how he was going to look on his first day at Stonewall High. Like he was wearing bits of old elephant skin, probably. Dudley and Uncle Vernon came in, both with wrinkled noses because of the smell from Harry's new uniform. Uncle Vernon opened his newspaper as usual, and Dudley banged his smelting stick, which he carried everywhere, on the table. That's this one. It's not very much to look at, this one, but there's been some very exciting pages. On we go. Another exciting page has come up. They heard the click of the letterbox and flopped of letters on the doormat. "Get the post, Dudley," said Uncle Vernon from behind his paper. "Make Harry get it." "Get the post, Harry." "Make Dudley get it." "Poke him with your smelting stick, Dudley." Harry dodged the smelting stick and went to get the post. 3 things lay on the doormat: a postcard from Uncle Vernon's sister Marge, who was in holiday at the Isle of Wight, a brown envelope that looked like a bill, and a letter for Harry. Harry picked it up and stared at it, his heart twanging like a giant elastic band. No one ever in his whole life had written to him. Who would? He had no friends, no other relatives, and didn't belong to a library, so he'd never even got rude notes asking for book back. Yet here it was, a letter, addressed so plainly that there could be no mistake. Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, 4 Privet Drive, Little Winning, Surrey. The envelope was thick and heavy and made of yellowish parchment, and the address was written in emerald green ink. There was no stamp. Turning the envelope over, his hands trembling, Harry saw a purple wax seal bearing a coat of arms, a lion, an eagle, a badger, and a snake, surrounding a large letter H. "Hurry up, boy," shouted Uncle Vernon from the kitchen. "What are you doing, checking for letter bombs?" He chuckled at his own joke. And that's this exciting page. Harry went back to the kitchen, still staring at his letter. He handed Uncle Vernon the bill and the postcard, sat down slowly and began to open the yellowish envelope. Uncle Vernon ripped open the bill, snorted in disgust, and flipped over the postcard. "Marge is ill," he informed Aunt Petunia. "Ate a funny whelk." "Dad," said Dudley suddenly. "Dad, Harry's got something." Harry was on the point of unfolding his letter, which was written on the same heavy parchment as the envelope, when it was jerked sharply out of his hands by Uncle Vernon. "That's mine," said Harry, trying to snatch it back. "Who'd be writing to you?" sneered Uncle Vernon, shaking the letter open with one hand and glancing at it. His face went from red to green faster than a set of traffic lights. And it didn't stop there. Within seconds, it was the grey-white of old porridge. "Petunia," he gasped. Dudley tried to grab the letter to read it, but Uncle Vernon held it tight out of his reach. Aunt Petunia looked at it curiously and read the first line. For a moment it looked as though she might faint. She clutched her throat and made a choking noise. "Vernon, oh my goodness, Vernon." They stared at each other, seemingly to have forgotten that Harry and Dudley were still in the room. Dudley wasn't used to being ignored. He gave his father a sharp tap on the head with his smelting stick. "I want to read the letter," he said loudly. "I want to read it," said Harry furiously, "as it's mine." "Get out, both of you," croaked Uncle Vernon, stuffing the letter back inside the envelope. Harry didn't move. "I want my letter," he shouted. "Let me see it," demanded Dudley. "Out!" roared Uncle Vernon as he took both Harry and Dudley by the scruffs of their neck and threw them into the hall, slamming the kitchen door behind them. Harry and Dudley promptly had a furious but silent fight over who would listen at the keyhole. Dudley won, so Harry, his glasses dangling from one ear, lay flat on his stomach to listen at the crack of the door and the floor. "Vernon," Aunt Petunia was saying in a quivering voice, "look at the address. How could they possibly know where he sleeps? You don't think they're watching the house?" "Watching, spying, might be following us," muttered Uncle Vernon wildly. "But what should we do, Vernon? Should we write back, tell them we don't want?" Harry could see Uncle Vernon's shiny black shoes up and down the kitchen. "No," he said finally. "No, we'll ignore it. If they don't get an answer, yes, that'll be it. We won't do anything." And this is that. And yes. Oh no, my scarf has fallen down. I have my Harry Potter scarf. I am a Hufflepuff, as you can see. Proud Hufflepuff, reading Harry Potter. I was up there on my bookshelf, but it decided it wanted to fall down today. Next page we go. But I'm not having one in the house, Petunia. Didn't we swear when we took him in we'd stamp out that dangerous nonsense? That evening when he got back from work, Uncle Vernon did something he'd never did before. He visited Harry in his cupboard. "Where's my letter?" said Harry, the moment Uncle Vernon squeezed through the door. "Who's writing to me?" "No one. It was addressed to you by a mistake," said Uncle Vernon shortly. "I have burnt it." "It was not a mistake," said Harry angrily. "It had my cupboard on it." "Silence!" yelled Uncle Vernon, and a couple of spiders fell from the ceiling. He took a few deep breaths and then forced his face into a smile which looked quite painful. Yes, Harry. About this cupboard. Your aunt and I have been thinking. You're really getting a bit big for it. We think you might be nice if you moved into Dudley's second bedroom." "Why?" said Harry. "Don't ask questions," snapped his uncle. "Take this stuff upstairs now." The Dursleys' house had 4 bedrooms, one for Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia, one for visitors, which usually Uncle Vernon's sister Marge, one where Dudley slept and one where Dudley kept all of the toys and things that wouldn't fit into his first room. It only took Harry one trip upstairs to move everything he owned, from the cupboard in the room to this room. Whew. He sat down on the bed and stared at him. Nearly everything in here was broken. The month-old cine camera was lying on top of the small working tank Dudley had once driven over next door's dog. In the corner was Dudley's first ever television set, which he had put his foot through when his favourite programme had been cancelled. There was a large bird cage which he had once held a parrot that Dudley had swapped at school for a real air rifle, which was up on the shelf with an end all bent because Dudley had sat on it. And that is this page here. I am very sorry about my stuttery reading. I don't read properly out loud, and just trying to form words in my head, so I'm very sorry about my stuttery reading, but hopefully it will get better. Other shelves were full of books. They were the only things in the room that looked as though they had never been touched. From downstairs came the sound of Dudley bawling at his mother. "I don't want him in there. I need that room. Make him get out." Harry sighed and stretched out the bed. Yesterday he had given everything to be up here. Today he'd rather be back in his cupboard with that letter than up here without it. Next morning at breakfast, everyone was rather quiet. Dudley was in shock. He screamed, whacked his father with his smelting stick, been sick on purpose, kicked his mother and thrown his tortoise. thrown his tortoise. Wow. Thrown his tortoise through a greenhouse roof, and he still didn't have his room back. Harry was thinking about this time yesterday and bitterly wishing he had opened the letter in the hall. Uncle Vernon and Aunt Petunia kept looking at each other darkly. When the post arrived, Uncle Vernon, who seemed to be trying to be nice to Harry, made Dudley go and get it. They heard him banging things with his smelting stick all the way down the hall. Then he shouted, "There's another one! Mr. H. Potter, the smallest bedroom, 4 Privet Drive." With a strangled cry, Uncle Vernon leaped from his seat and ran down the hall, Harry right behind him. Uncle Vernon had to wrestle Dudley to the ground to get that letter from him, which was made difficult by the fact that Harry had grabbed Uncle Vernon around the neck from behind. After a minute of confused fighting in which everyone got hit a lot by the smelting stick, Uncle Vernon straightened up, gasping for breath, with Harry's letter clutched in his hand. "Go to your cupboard, your bedroom," he wheezed at Harry. "Dudley, go. Just go." Harry walked round and round his new room. Someone knew he had moved out of the cupboard, and they seemed to know he hadn't received his first letter. Surely this meant they're trying again, and this time he made sure they didn't fail. He had a plan. The repaired alarm clock rang at 6 o'clock in the morning. Harry turned it off quickly and dressed silently. He mustn't wake the Dursleys. He stole downstairs without turning on any of the lights. He was going to wait for the postman on the corner of Privet Drive and get the letter from the number 4 first. His heart hammered as he crept across the dark hall to the front door. Ah! Harry leaped into the air. He had trodden on something big, squishy on the doormat. Something alive. Lights clicked on upstairs, and to his horror, Harry realised that the big squishy thing had been his uncle's face. Uncle Vernon had been lying at the foot of the front door in a sleeping bag, clearly making sure that Harry didn't do exactly what he had been trying to do. He had shouted at Harry for about half an hour and then told him to go and make a cup of tea. Harry shuffled miserably off into the kitchen, and by the time he got back, the post had arrived. Right into Uncle Vernon's lap. Harry could see 3 letters addressed in green ink. He began, but Uncle Vernon was tearing the letters into pieces before his eyes. That's this page. How long do we have of this chapter? A few pages left to go. We'll try to get through them all. Uncle Vernon didn't go to work that day. He stayed home and nailed up the letterbox. "See," he explained to Aunt Petunia through a mouthful of nails, "if they can't deliver them, they'll just give up." "I'm not sure that'll work, Vernon." "Oh, these people's minds work in strange ways, Petunia. They're not like you and me," said Uncle Vernon, trying to knock in the nails with a piece of fruit cake Aunt Petunia had just brought him. On Friday, no fewer than 12 letters had arrived for Harry. As they couldn't go through the letterbox, they had been pushed under the door slotted through the slides, and a few even forced through the small windows in the downstairs toilet. Uncle Vernon stayed at home again after burning all the letters he had got out a hammer and nails and boarded up the cracks around the front and back doors so no one could go out. He hummed, tiptoe through the tulips as he worked and jumped at small noises. On Saturday, things began to get out of hand. 24 letters to Harry found their way into the house, rolled up the hidden inside each of the 12 dozen eggs. What? Letters in the eggs? Fair enough. 2 dozen eggs that their very confused milkman had handed Aunt Petunia through the living room window. While Uncle Vernon made furious telephone calls to the post office and the dairy, trying to find someone to complain to, Aunt Petunia shredded the letters in her food mixer. "Who on earth wants to talk to you badly?" Dudley asked Harry in amazement. On Sunday morning, Uncle Vernon sat down at the breakfast table, looking tired and rather ill, but happy. "No post on Sundays," he reminded them happily, as he spread marmalade on his newspaper. "No damn letters today." Something came whirling down the kitchen chimney as he spoke and caught him sharply on the back of the head. Next moment, 30 or 40 letters came pelting out the fireplace like bullets. The Dursleys ducked, but Harry leapt into the air trying to catch one. "Out! Out!" Uncle Vernon seized Harry around the waist and threw him into the hall. When Aunt Petunia and Dudley had run out with their arms over their faces, Uncle Vernon slammed the door shut. They could hear the letters still streaming into the room, bouncing off the walls and floors. "That does it," said Uncle Vernon, trying to speak calmly, but pulling great tufts of his moustache at the same time. "I want you all back here in 5 minutes, ready to leave. We're going away. Just pack some clothes. No arguments." That's this page. You know what? I think that's a great place to leave it for today. We shall read the rest of chapter 3 tomorrow. We've got 1, 2, 3 more pages. Well, 1, 2, 4, 5 more pages left to read until we're on chapter 4, The Keeper of the Keys. Thank you everyone who have joined me today. It has been a pleasure to read. And yes, I shall be back tomorrow. I think we'll be doing this a bit earlier than we have today. And yes, we shall see you in the next video. Bye!